Everyone, welcome to the video lecture for Unit 2, Module 5.2. In this one, we're going to talk about pressure and resistance within the cardiovascular system. As always, here are the learning objectives. Make sure to know these for your lecture quizzes and your unit exams. Let's go ahead and get started. So the purpose of cardiovascular regulation is the maintenance of adequate blood flow through the capillaries and peripheral tissues and organs. Under normal circumstances, blood flow is equal to cardiac output. When cardiac output goes up, so does the blood flow through the capillary beds, and when cardiac output declines, capillary blood flow is reduced. Capillary blood flow is determined by the interplay between pressure and resistance in the cardiovascular network. To keep blood moving, the heart must generate enough pressure to overcome the resistance to blood flow in the pulmonary and systemic circuits. In general terms, flow is directly proportional to the pressure. Basically, increased pressure equals increased flow, and inversely proportional to the resistance. Increased resistance is going to decrease flow. However, the absolute pressure is less important than the pressure gradient, which is the difference in pressure from one end of the vessel to the other. This relationship can basically be summarized as flow is equal to the delta P, or change in pressure, over the resistance, or R. The largest pressure gradient is found between the base of the aorta and the proximal ends of the peripheral capillary beds. The cardiovascular center can alter this pressure gradient and change the rate of capillary blood flow by adjusting cardiac output and peripheral resistance. Blood leaving the peripheral capillaries enters the venous system. The pressure gradient across the venous system is relatively small, but venous resistance is very low. The low venous blood pressure, aided by valves, skeletal muscle contraction, gravity, and other factors, is enough to return the blood to the heart. When necessary, cardiovascular control centers can raise venous pressure through vasoconstriction or venoconstriction to improve venous return and maintain adequate cardiac output. So we'll begin this module by examining blood pressure and resistance more closely. We will then consider the mechanisms of capillary exchange, the transfer of liquid and solutes between the blood pressure and interstitial fluids. Capillary exchange provides tissues with oxygen and nutrients and removes the carbon dioxide and waste products that are generated by active cells. Active tissues need more blood flow than inactive ones. Even something as simple as a change in position, going from sitting to standing, for instance, or orthostatics, triggers a number of cardiovascular changes. And we'll end this section with a discussion of what those changes are and how they're coordinated. So, in talking about cardiovascular pressures, three values are usually reported. One, the blood pressure. The term blood pressure refers to arterial pressure, usually reported in millimeters of mercury, or mmHg. Systemic arterial pressures in adults average from about 120 millimeters of mercury at the entrance of the aorta to roughly about 35 at the start of a capillary network. Also, two, in capillary hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure is the force exerted by a fluid pressing against a wall. Capillary hydrostatic pressure, or CHP, or capillary pressure, is the pressure within capillary walls. Along the length of a typical capillary, pressures decline from roughly 35 to about 18. Then three, venous pressure. Venous pressure is the pressure within the venous system. Venous pressure is quite low. The pressure gradient from the venules to the right atrium is only about 18. The difference in pressure, or delta P, across the entire systemic circuit, sometimes called the circulatory pressure, averages about 100 millimeters per mercury. For circulation to occur, the circulatory pressure must overcome the total peripheral resistance, or the resistance of the entire cardiovascular system. The arterial network has by far the largest pressure gradient, at around 85, and this primarily reflects the relatively high resistance of the arterioles. The total peripheral resistance of the cardiovascular system reflects a combination of factors: vascular resistance, blood viscosity, and turbulence. Vascular resistance, or the force that opposes blood flow in the blood vessels, is the largest component. The most important factor in vascular resistance is the friction between blood and the vessel walls. The amount of friction depends on two factors: the vessel length and the vessel diameter. In adults, the vessel length can increase or decrease gradually when individuals gain or lose weight, but on a day-to-day basis, this component of vascular resistance can be considered constant. Vessel diameter, or the effects of friction on blood, act in a narrow zone closest to the vessel wall. In a small diameter vessel, friction within the walls slows nearly all blood. Resistance is therefore relatively high. Blood near the center of a large diameter vessel does not encounter friction within the walls, so the resistance in large vessels is fairly low. Differences in diameter have much more significant effects on resistance than do differences in length. If two vessels are equal in radius, or one half the diameter, but one is twice as long as the longer vessel offers twice as much resistance to the blood flow. But for two vessels of equal length, one twice the radius of the other, the narrow one offers 16 times as much resistance to blood flow. This relationship can be expressed in terms of the vessel radius r and resistance, which is a capital R, and it can be summarized as r is proportional to 1 over the vessel radius to the fourth power. More significantly, there is no way to control vessel length, but vessel diameter can change quickly through the vasoconstriction or vasodilation. Most of the peripheral resistance occurs in arterioles, or the smallest vessels of the arterial system. As noted earlier in this module, arterioles are extremely muscular. The walls of each arteriole within an inner diameter of about 30 microns can have a 20 micron thick layer of smooth muscles. When these smooth muscles contract or relax, peripheral resistance increases or decreases because of a small change in diameter produces a large change in resistance, or mechanisms that alter the diameter of arterioles provide control over peripheral resistance of blood flow. Viscosity is the resistance to flow caused by interactions among molecules and suspended materials in a liquid. Liquids of low viscosity, such as water, which has a viscosity of about 1, flow at low pressures. Thick syrupy fluids, such as molasses, which has a viscosity around 300, flow under only high pressures. Whole blood has a viscosity of about 5 times that of water due to its plasma proteins and the blood cells. Under normal conditions, the viscosity of blood remains stable. Anemia, polycythemia, and other disorders that affect the hematocrit also change blood viscosity, and thus peripheral resistance. High flow rates, irregular surfaces, and sudden changes in vessel diameter upset the smooth flow of blood, creating eddies and swirls. This phenomenon, called turbulence, increases the resistance and slows blood flow. Turbulence normally occurs when blood flow between the atria and the ventricles, and between the ventricles and the aortic and pulmonary trunks. It also develops in large arteries, such as the aorta, when cardiac output and arterial flow rates are very high. However, turbulence seldom occurs in smaller vessels, unless their walls are damaged. For example, an atherosclerotic plaque creates abnormal turbulence and restricts blood flow. Because turbulence makes a distinctive sound, or a bruit, plaques in large blood vessels can often be detected with a stethoscope. So take a look at the graphs here for an overview of the vessel diameters, cross-sectional areas, pressures, and viscosity of blood flow in the systemic circuit. So when talking about vessel diameters, as blood flow proceeds from the aorta to the capillaries, vessels diverge. The arteries branch repeatedly, and each branch is smaller in diameter than the preceding one. As blood proceeds from the capillaries towards the vena cava, vessels converge. Vessel diameters increase as the venules combine to form small and medium-sized vein. When looking at the total cross-sectional areas, although all the arterioles and capillaries and venules are smaller in diameter, the body has a large number of them. All of the blood flowing to the aorta also flows to the peripheral capillaries. Blood pressure and the speed of blood flow are proportional to the cross-sectional area of the vessels involved. What is important is not the cross-sectional area of each individual vessel, but the combined cross-sectional areas of all vessels. In effect, your blood moves from one big pipe, the aorta, with a cross-sectional area about 4.5 centimeters squared, into countless tiny ones, or the peripheral capillaries with a total cross-sectional area of about 5,000 centimeters squared. And then the blood travels back to the heart through two large pipes, which are the vena cava. When talking about pressures, or average blood pressures, which is noted as C in this graph, as arteries branch, their total cross-sectional areas increase and blood pressure falls rapidly. Most of the decline takes place in the small arteries and the arterioles. Venous pressures are relatively low. And lastly, the velocity of blood flow. As the total cross-sectional areas of this vessel increases from the aorta to the capillaries, the velocity of blood flow decreases. Blood flow from velocity then increases as total cross-sectional area drops from the capillaries towards the vena cava. Systemic pressures are highest in the aorta, peaking at about 120. Pressures reach a minimum of 2 at the entrance to the right atrium. Pressures in the pulmonary circuit are much lower than those in the systemic circuit. At the right ventricle, does not ordinarily develop high pressures because the pulmonary vessels are much shorter and more distendable than systemic vessels, thus providing less resistance to blood flow. Arterial blood pressure is important because it maintains blood flow through the capillary beds. To do this, it must always be high enough to overcome the peripheral resistance. Arterial pressure is not constant. Rather, it rises during ventricular systole and falls during ventricular diastole. The peak blood pressure measured during the ventricular systole is called the systolic pressure, and the minimum blood pressure at the end of ventricular diastole is called diastolic pressure. In recording blood pressure, we separate systolic and diastolic pressures by a slash, as in 120/80 or 110/75. A pulse is a rhythmic fluctuation in pressure that accompanies each heartbeat. The difference between the systolic and diastolic pressures is the pulse pressure. To report a single blood pressure value, we use the mean arterial pressure, or the MAP. It's calculated by adding 1/3 of the pulse pressure to the diastolic pressure. So basically, MAP is equal to the diastolic pressure plus pulse pressure divided by 3. For a systolic pressure of 120 and a diastolic pressure of 90, we can calculate MAP as MAP is equal to 90 plus 120 minus 90 divided by 3, which is also equal to 90, plus 10 equals 100. A normal range of systolic and diastolic pressures occurs in healthy individuals. When pressures shift outside the normal range, clinical problems develop. Abnormally high blood pressure is termed hypertension. Abnormally low blood pressure is called hypotension. Hypertension is much more common. In fact, many cases of hypertension result from overly aggressive drug treatment for hypertension. The usual criterion established by the American Heart Association for stage 1 hypertension in adults is a systolic blood pressure in the range from about 140 to 159 and a diastolic range from about 90 to 99. Values from 120 to 139 for systolic pressure and 80 to 89 for diastolic pressures indicate pre-hypertension. Blood pressure less than 120/80 is normal. Cardiologists often recommend some combination of diet modification and drug therapy for people whose blood pressures are consistently prehypertensive. Hypertension significantly increases the workload on the heart, and the left ventricle gradually enlarges. More muscle mass means a greater demand for oxygen. When the coronary circulation cannot keep pace, signs and symptoms of coronary ischemia appear. Increased arterial pressures also place a physical stress on the walls of the blood vessels throughout the body. This stress promotes or accelerates the development of arteriosclerosis. It also indicates the risk of aneurysms, heart attacks, and strokes. As systolic pressures climb, the arterial walls stretch, just as an extra puff of air expands a partially inflated balloon. This expansion allows the arterial system to accommodate some of the blood provided by the ventricular systole. When diastole begins and blood pressures fall, the arteries recoil to their original dimensions. This phenomenon is called elastic rebound. Some blood is forced back towards the left ventricle, closing the aortic valve and helping to drive additional blood into the coronary arteries. However, most of the push from elastic rebound forces blood towards the capillaries. This maintains blood flow along the arterial network, while the left ventricle is in diastole. Talk about pressures that are affecting small arteries and arterioles. The mean arterial pressure and the pulse pressure become smaller as the distance from the heart increases. The mean arterial pressure declines as the artery branches and becomes smaller and more numerous. In essence, blood pressure decreases as it overcomes friction and produces blood flow. The pulse pressure also loosens due to the cumulative effects of elastic rebound along the arterial system. The effect can be likened to a series of ever softer echoes following a loud shout. Each time an echo is produced, the reflecting surface absorbs some of the sound energy. Eventually, the echo disappears. The pressure surge accompanying ventricular ejection is like the shout, and it's reflected by the wall of the aorta, echoing down the arterial system until it finally disappears at the level of the small arterioles. By the time blood reaches the precapillary sphincter, no pressure fluctuations remain, and the blood pressure is steady at approximately 35. Venous pressure, although low, determines venous return, the amount of blood that arrives at the right atrium each minute. Venous return has a direct impact on cardiac output. Blood pressure at the start of the venous system is only about 1/10 than that at the start of the arterial system, but the blood must still travel through a vascular network as complex as the arterial system before returning to the heart. Pressures at the entrance of the right atrium fluctuate, but they average about 2 or so. Thus, the effective pressure in the venous system is roughly 16 from about 18 in the venules to about 2 in the vena cava. This pressure compares with about 65 in the arterial system, from about 100 at the aorta to about 35 at the capillaries. Yet, although venous pressures are low, veins offer comparatively little resistance, so pressure declines very slowly as blood moves to the venous system. As blood flow moves towards the heart, the veins become larger, resistance drops, and the velocity of blood flow increases. When you stand, the venous blood returning from your body inferior to the heart must overcome gravity as it travels up the inferior vena cava. Two factors assist the low venous pressures in propelling blood towards your heart: muscular compressions of peripheral veins and the respiratory pump during inhalation. The contraction of skeletal muscles near a vein compress it, helping to push blood towards the heart. The valves in small and medium-sized vein ensure that blood flows in one direction only. When you're standing and walking, the cycles of contraction and relaxation that accompany your normal movements assist in venous return. If you stand at attention, with knees locked and leg muscles immobilized, that assistance is lost. The reduction in venous return then leads to a fall in cardiac output, which reduces the blood supply to the brain. This decline is sometimes enough to cause fainting, which is a temporary loss of consciousness. You would then collapse, but then while you were in the horizontal position, both venous return and cardiac output would return to normal. As you inhale, your thoracic cavity expands, reducing the pressure within the pleural cavities. This drop in pressure pulls air into your lungs. At the same time, it also pulls blood into the inferior vena cava and the right atrium from the smaller veins of your abdominal cavity and the lower body. The effect on venous return through the superior vena cava is less pronounced because blood in that vessel is normally assisted by gravity. As you exhale, your thoracic cavity decreases in size. Internal pressure then rises, forcing air out of your lungs and pushing venous blood to the right atrium. This mechanism is called the respiratory pump. Such pumping action becomes more important during heavy exercise, when respirations are deep and frequent. Capillary exchange plays a key role in homeostasis. The most important processes that move materials across typical capillary walls are diffusion, filtration, and reabsorption. Diffusion is the movement of ions or molecules from an area where their concentration is higher to an area where their concentration is lower. The difference between the high and low concentrations represents a concentration gradient. Diffusion tends to eliminate that gradient. Diffusion occurs most rapidly when 1. The distances involved are short, 2. The concentration gradient is large, and 3. The ions or molecules involved are small. Different substances diffuse across capillary walls by different routes. 1. Water, ions, and small organic molecules such as glucose, amino acids, and urea can usually enter or leave the bloodstream by diffusion between adjacent endothelial cells or through the pores of fenestrated capillaries. 2. Many ions, including sodium, potassium, calcium, and chloride, can diffuse across endothelial cells by passing through channels in plasma membranes. 3. Large water-soluble compounds are unable to enter or leave the bloodstream except at fenestrated capillaries, such as those of the hypothalamus, the kidneys, many endocrine organs, and the intestinal tract. 4. Lipids such as fatty acids and steroids, and lipid-soluble materials, including stable soluble gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide, can cross capillary walls by diffusing through the endothelial plasma membranes. And 5, plasma proteins are normally unable to cross the endothelial lining anywhere except in the sinusoids, such as those of the liver where the plasma proteins enter the bloodstream. Filtration is the removal of solutes as a solution flows through a porous membrane. Solutes too large to pass through the pores are filtered out of the solution. The driving force for filtration is hydrostatic pressure. As we saw earlier, it pushes water from an area of higher pressure to an area of low pressure. In capillary filtration, water and small solutes are forced across a capillary wall, leaving larger solutes and suspended proteins in the bloodstream. The solute molecules that leave the bloodstream are small enough to pass between adjacent endothelial cells or through the pores in a fenestrated capillary. Filtration likely takes place primarily at the arterial end of a capillary, where the capillary hydrostatic pressure, or CHP, is highest. Reabsorption occurs as the result of osmosis. Osmosis is a special term for the diffusion of water across a selectively permeable membrane that separates two solutions of differing solute concentrations. Water molecules tend to diffuse across a membrane towards the solution containing the higher solute concentration. The osmotic pressure of a solution is an indication of the force of the osmotic water movement. In other words, it represents the pressure that must be applied to prevent osmotic movement across a membrane. The higher the solute concentration of a solution, the greater is the solution's osmotic pressure. The presence of suspended proteins that cannot cross capillary walls creates an osmotic pressure called blood colloid osmotic pressure, or BCOP. Clinicians also often use the term onconic pressure when referring to the colloid osmotic pressure of the body fluids. The two terms are equivalent. Osmotic water movement continues until either the solute concentrations are equalized or an imposing hydrostatic pressure prevents the movement. Next, we're going to take a look at the interplay between the filtration and reabsorption along the length of a typical capillary. In this discussion, remember that hydrostatic pressure forces water out of a solution and osmotic pressure draws water into the solution. So the continuous movement of water out of the capillaries, through the peripheral tissues, and then back into the bloodstream by way of the lymphatic system has four important functions. One, it ensures that plasma and interstitial fluid, two major components of extracellular fluid, are in constant communication and mutual exchange. Two, it accelerates the distribution of nutrients, hormones, and dissolved gases through the tissues. Three, it assists in the transport of insoluble lipids and tissue proteins that cannot enter the bloodstream by crossing the capillary walls. And four, it has a flushing action that carries bacterial toxins and other chemical stimuli to lymphatic tissues and organs that are responsible for providing immunity to disease. Capillary blood pressure declines as blood flows from the arterial end to the venous end of a capillary. As a result, the rates of filtration and reabsorption gradually change as blood passes along the length of a capillary. Net hydrostatic pressure is the difference between the pressure inside the capillary wall and the hydrostatic pressure outside the capillary. The net capillary hydrostatic pressure tends to push water and solutes out of the capillaries and into the interstitial fluid. Factors that contribute to the net hydrostatic pressure include 1. The capillary hydrostatic pressure, which ranges from 35 at the arterial end of a capillary to about 18 at the venous end, and 2. The interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure, or IHP. Measurements of IHP have yielded very small values that differ from tissue to tissue, from 16 in the brain to 26 in the subcutaneous tissues. A positive IHP opposes CHP, and the tissue hydrostatic pressure must be overcome before the fluid can move out of a capillary. A negative IHP assists the CHP, and additional fluid will be pulled out of the capillary. However, under normal circumstances, the average IHP is 0, and we can assume that net hydrostatic pressure is equal to CHP. Plasma proteins in capillary blood create capillary colloid osmotic pressure. The net capillary colloid osmotic pressure, or the onconic pressure, tends to pull water and solutes into a capillary from the interstitial fluid. The net onconic pressure is the difference between 1. The blood colloid osmotic pressure, the BCOP, which is about 25, and 2. The interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure, or the ICOP. The ICOP is as variable and low as the IHP because the interstitial fluid in most tissues contains negligible quantities of suspended proteins. Reported values of ICOP are from 0 to 5, within the ranges of pressure recorded for the IHP. It is thus safe to assume that under normal circumstances, the net colloid osmotic pressure is equal to the BCOP. The net filtration pressure, or the NFP, is the difference between the net hydrostatic pressure and the net osmotic pressure. In terms of the factors just listed, this means that the net filtration equals the net hydrostatic minus the net colloid pressure of the osmotic pressure. At the arterial end of a capillary, the net filtration pressure can be calculated as follows. So basically, NFP would be equal to 35 minus 0, minus 25 minus 0, which would be equal to 35 minus 25, which would be equal to 10. Because this value is positive, it indicates that fluid will tend to move out of the capillary and into the interstitial fluid. At the venous end of the capillary, the net filtration pressure will be 18 minus 0 minus 25 minus 0, which would be equal to 18 minus 25, or negative 7. The minus sign indicates that the fluid tends to move into the capillary. That is, reabsorption is occurring. The transition between filtration and reabsorption occurs where the CHP is about 25, because at that point the hydrostatic and osmotic forces are equal. That is, the NFP is equal to 0. If the maximum filtration pressure at the arterial end of the capillary were equal to the maximum reabsorption pressure at the venous end, this transition point would lie midway along the length of the capillary. Under these circumstances, filtration would occur along the first half of the capillary, and an identical amount of reabsorption would occur along the second half. However, the maximum filtration pressure is higher than the maximum reabsorption pressure, so the transition point between the filtration and reabsorption normally lies closer to the venous end of the capillary than to the arterial end. As a result, more filtration than reabsorption occurs along the capillary. Of the nearly 24 liters of fluid that move out of the plasma and into the interstitial fluid each day, 20.4 liters, so about 85%, are reabsorbed. The remainder, about 3.6 liters, flows through the tissues and into the lymphatic vessels for eventual return to the venous system. Any condition that affects hydrostatic or osmotic pressures in the blood or tissues will shift the balance between hydrostatic and osmotic forces. We can then predict the effects of the basis of understanding of capillary dynamics. For example, if hemorrhaging occurs, both blood volume and blood pressure decrease. This reduction in CHP lowers the NFP and increases the amount of reabsorption. The result is a decrease in the volume of interstitial fluid and an increase in the circulating plasma volume. This process is known as a recall of fluids. If dehydration occurs, the plasma volume decreases due to water loss, and the concentration of blood proteins increases. The increase in BCOP accelerates the reabsorption and recall of fluids that delays the onset and severity of clinical signs and symptoms. If the CHP rises or the BCOP declines, fluid moves out of the blood and builds up in peripheral tissues, a condition called edema.